Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's live stream presentation. My name is John. I am the tattoo historian, and for some reason we have lost Pete. We'll try getting back here momentarily. Thank you to everyone who's watching us on YouTube and on Facebook Live. We are trying to get Pete back online, which is an amazing thing to see that he has left the building, apparently. But without further ado, there goes Pete. All right, Evan, I guess we're on all right until Pete comes back in. So joining us tonight is Evan Kutzler. Evan has this tremendous workout called Living by Inches, the Smells, Sounds, Tastes, and Feeling of Captivity in Civil War Prisons. I have placed a link to the press in the description, and I've also gone to great lengths to get you the code for the 40% off code to UNC Press. Thank you to UNC Press for allowing us to have that code for us to get the 40% off. So you guys can check that out at the UNC Press website. Evan, how are you this evening?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm great. I'm waiting to get the message from Pete that he's freaking out that he can't get back in. So that's going to be fun. Sure. But since Pete's not here to do the formal introduction, Evan, would you like to give everyone a little bit of background on yourself with your education and where you are now? Because you're very close to a very famous place that I would love to visit.
You should come down and visit. We have things, not just Civil War sites to see, but I'm in Americus, Georgia, 10 miles away from Andersonville National Historic Site, 10 miles away from Jimmy Carter National Historic Site in Plain. Carter still live. I teach at Georgia Southwestern State University. Teach U.S. history, public history. My educational background, to keep it brief, I went to Centre College in Kentucky. Got my master's and PhD from the University of South Carolina.
Wow. This whole book really fascinated me, and I want to get into that here in a few minutes. But I really want to talk to you about the background with, you have an interpretive background as well, Evan?
Yeah, I do.
Andersonville. Would you like to talk about that and how that influenced you as a historian?
Well, it goes a little bit further than that. So my job after I got my PhD, before I had a teaching job, was as a seasonal park ranger at Andersonville. It was a challenge, right? It was a big challenge to realize I've learned all this material about academic history. Now, how do I present this in a provocative, accessible, meaningful way to diverse public audiences, right? That doesn't come easily out of PhD programs. I had a little bit of a head start. My first real job was working at the Carter House Museum in Franklin, Tennessee. So I gave tours of what was left, or what is left, of the Franklin battlefield. So it's one farmstead surrounded by early 20th century sprawl. But there was an opportunity there to kind of, I wanted to go back into interpretation to rediscover why I fell in love with doing history in the first place. And that was, talking with people and sharing stories about the past.
Mm-hmm. And your advisor during your dissertation was Dr. Mark Smith, correct?
That's right. And
he really approached a lot of the Civil War history in various ways, and has written extensively on that. How did that experience impact you going forward as well? Because I'm going into a dissertation program here soon, and I'm like, how's my advisor going to impact me? And I often ask people, how did an advisor for your dissertation impact you?
Well, Mark's work and Mark's mentorship gave me the language to expand what I was already doing, and the direction that I was moving to begin with. Going back to the Carter House, I would not have called it sensory history at the time.
Oh, really?
Because, well, I would have called it history. I was talking about a battle, but I was talking about a battle that was fought 4/5 after dark, about from the perspective of a family that's hiding in the basement, and the aftermath, right? What do 17 dead horses in the backyard smell like 3 weeks after the battle? And so and as part of this came out of the necessity of, the landscape, there's a highway running right in front of the house. It's very hard for a visitor to imagine this as a rural space. And so evoking the historical senses, the historical landscape was central to that. Again, I wouldn't have called it sensory history at the time. Those were tools, or methodological tools that I picked up along the way, thanks to Mark's mentorship.
Yeah, I was an interpreter for a couple decades, and we do that kind of history, right, without even thinking about it, where we're trying to connect someone with the senses and trying to say, this is what it would have smelled like, or this is what it would have obviously looked like, and what you would have heard. And we didn't, like you say, we didn't consider that sensory history. But
Right.
But now it's, when I first saw that you were going to be coming on, and that I received a copy of your book, it's like, okay, this is what we were talking about a while back when we were doing interpretation, but we never called it this, which was a really cool thing to think about for a while, because that made me take the book in different ways than I normally would, because of the experience, right? And that must have hit home for you on a number of occasions, where it's like, oh, I remember talking about this in this way. So yeah, that's fantastic. And again, it's an awesome read. Again, everyone, I want to hold it up just so people can see what it is. I put the link on there for the UNC Press site. You guys know that we put the nice discount code up as well. So to start out, Evan, since we've already discussed this term a number of times, what would you consider sensory history?
I'm very hesitant to try to define the field in a single breath, right? That's like, here's I can do a lot more damage to myself than I can get myself any favors. Sensory history, I think, is less of a distinct field. It's an approach. Sometimes it's called a habit, right? A method. There's a journal of senses in society, right? That does what I would consider very high level sensory history. The intellectual history of knowledge, right? Of how of the hierarchy of the senses. Is vision is vision the rational sense? When did that happen? Why? What are the entanglements of that? What happens when we kind of invert the sensorium? What are the entangled histories of that? That's a sensory history. There's also other sensory histories, and I hate to call it low level sensory history, but there's the sensory history of experience, right? The sensory history of daily life. How do the senses help us to texture the past, to understand, to put a historical person, a figure in their time and place, and help to explain the ways in which they were navigating the world, right? Sensory history can be very, very broad. It also can help us explain the very specific. And so it can be as big as transnational intellectual history, or as small as a historic site. But the key difference is, because again, we all invoke the senses, right? Open up a stillness at appomattox, right? Open up Bell Wiley, right? Open up, turn on a documentary, and the senses are going to be there. It's not like this is like, oh, we just discovered that people in the past had 5 senses, more or less. But
right.
The difference is that if a historian who is intentionally approaching it as a sensory historian, says that the past smelled this way to a person for these reasons, there's an expectation that is in fact in the kind of evidentiary level, right? It's not simply narrative flair, which is often unfortunately the case is.
Right. Where did this all begin before it became obviously a long process of research and writing and such? Where did that all start?
I was looking for a topic, right? I knew I liked the Civil War era. I struggled, figuring, and you'll have to come to this when you're deciding what you're going to write about.
Right.
I wasn't sure. Do I want to be a Civil War historian? Right? Do I want to continue in this path? Yeah. I like public history. I knew I liked public history. I knew I liked history. I knew that I had, I had some, I was a pretty good researcher, a pretty good kind of sleuth. But would I have the interest to carry on a project 5 or 10 years down the road from 2010? And what I liked about the census, and it was one of Mark Smith's books called How Race is Made, that really was kind of that aha moment. And it was about how race is made, the census, slavery, segregation, and the census. And it's about how, it's deconstructing race through the census historically. How does this come about? And it was so crystal clear that this is a really interesting analytical angle that can be used in so many different ways. What if I take these sources that I'm already familiar with and try to kind of apply this methodology to them? I didn't know much about Civil War prisons at the time. I knew it as a personal frontier for me, and it was an area that I also knew hadn't been explored as much, right? And that's all of course a relative term, right? Because anything that doesn't have 3 dozen books on it in the Civil War era is not been touched. is fertile ground,
right?
But the trauma of the prisoner of war experience and the experiences seem to be, a perfect laboratory for saying, all right, how can I unpack these experiences through the 5 senses? I took a trip down to Andersonville the summer, that first summer between my first and second year in graduate school. I wanted to see just, what does Andersonville have? I wasn't expecting, and they don't have, a treasure trove of original documents that aren't anywhere else. They have a lot of copies of stuff, but they've collected a lot of materials together. And I was blown away, right? Someone told me, when you go to Andersonville, it's going to change how you see the American Civil War, no matter what you think you know about it beforehand. And I sat there, reading these incredibly visceral wartime accounts, and I'd been desensitized to a lot of the battle violence that we read about. This was different, and it was kind of personally touching that I knew, immediately that this was going to be not just a dissertation project, but this was going to be a book project as well. In fact, I had big plans that weekend. I was going to go back. I was going to go to Andersonville, spend a day researching, and then see some friends in Atlanta on the way home. I was so affected by the sources, by the documents, that I said, no, I just got to drive straight on through the night. I need to get home. But it was that was the energy that I needed to commit to something for years and years and years.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's why I need to make the pilgrimage down there, because I had an ancestor who died at Andersonville. I think that connection is very necessary to go down there and check that out. And that leads to this idea of sensory history, right? Where you can connect it with your audience, because everyone has smelled something horrible, or everyone has eaten something horrible, or whatever that may be. And it kind of goes to what Cameron, one of the CWI students, said. You kind of already answered this, but would you consider this sensory history as an extension of public history because of its ability to reach the public and make historical experiences understandable?
It can be, right? It is certainly, the senses are something that connect humanity, right? We all have 5 senses, more or less, right? I say more or less because, who's to say there are 5 senses, right? That itself is a historical creation. So that has changed over time, right? And how many there are. I wouldn't say it's inherently public history, or I wouldn't say that any type of history, any methodology is inherently public history. In fact, and if you want a good example of this, I'm going to get in trouble for this, but go to Senses in Society and read some of those articles and tell me if you think that's public history. It's really good, detailed historical work, but I would never call it accessible to a public audience. So that has to be created too. That has to be it has to be written in a certain way. You have to go into it intentionally, saying, "I'm going to try to do public history." In part because if you go out to Andersonville and say, "Today I'm gonna enlighten you about the sensory history of Civil War prisons, you might start losing audience members immediately.
Yeah, they're gonna glaze over.
Yeah, you have to go in there. We're gonna talk about experience, right? We're gonna talk about we're gonna put you in the mindset of 1864. We're gonna strip away our preconceptions about what smells badly, and we're gonna talk about what it meant to an 18-year-old from a farm who's describing it to a hog pen, right? That hog pen means something to that person. It doesn't mean anything to me. I didn't grow up on a farm, right? But it meant something to these people, and the fact that is a kind of recurring metaphor is something we should pay attention to. That I think is how you take it from being kind of up there sensory history and this is on the ground experiential sensory history.
It's almost like this ever-changing point in the field where it was a top-down approach for years and years, and now it's almost like a bottom-up approach. That's the way I kind of see it. You may see it differently or not, but I've always seen it as like, okay, this is what the person in the prison, in this case, smelled, heard, felt, and everything else, instead of worrying about what the prison commandant is doing. We're going from bottom up. And I'm wondering, with that and academia and public history working almost tandem now, how you see that approach going forward. With Pete and I had this discussion a number of weeks ago where we said that we're starting to see the leveling of the field, where a lot of interpreters and public historians and museums are working side by side with people they wouldn't have worked with 20 years ago. And I'm wondering how sensory history or environmental historians or whomever it may be, you see this as well. Do you see this parallel, especially since you came from the public history field, you came from an interpretive experience, and now you've gone on to an academic experience? Do you see that transition a little bit easier than maybe it was?
I'm not. There's a lot of great public history out there, and there are a lot of I'm not sure that we're at the level where all of our historic sites, like the National Park Service, it does not always have trained historians in positions that you might expect trained historians to be in. The chief of interpretation, the superintendent at a lot of historic sites are coming from resource management. Or their political appointees, right? Or their wildlife, and that's necessary, right? We need those voices in there too, but that also comes at a cost as well. So I'm not sure I see there being a lot of that. Maybe that's because of the sites I'm thinking of in this moment. But I think it's overall. I mean, if we have public historians and academic historians, right, acknowledging that distinction is artificial, kind of competing over ideas, that's a really good thing. We should have. There shouldn't be a top-down approach where public history is what is distilled from academic historians, right? It needs to be being created at the historic site level too. And that's really exciting to see, right? A Reconstruction era National Historic Site is doing really great things, bringing in academic historians to shed light on or to discuss issues at that site. How does your research tell us about the experience here? And that's a really good thing. We need more of that, and I'm sure I expect we will.
So we spoke earlier about you wondering if you wanted to go into the field of Civil War history, because we've been inundated with so much over our lifetimes alone. But you went this course. How can sensory history help us understand, in the case of your book, not only the Civil War, but Civil War incarceration and Civil War prisons?
I think you touched on it already, right? Part of it is kind of inverting, what matters, right? Is it about the prison policy or management, or is it about the human experience? I think what sensory history helps do for captivity is it helps to individualize it. It helps to humanize, and not in some like sometimes the crude way humanize is meant, right? You can't make someone in the past any more human than they were, right? But you can, use, your narrative and your sources to kind of accentuate the fact that the people in the past who are experiencing these things, were fully human. And so that's I think that's where I see sensory history going, in both historic site interpretation, but specifically at prisons and in kind of the Civil War kind of era more broadly.
Mm-hmm. Touching on some of those senses, there's a number of them I'd like to talk to you about that are very important. But I like food. I'm a food historian kind of guy, and I just like to eat as well. But Cameron again, Cameron Sauer, CWI, he beat me to it. He asks you, when we talk about Civil War prisons, how does the sensory experience of food impact prisoners? And I think this is one of the most important aspects, because everybody eats. And so we can have this kind of conversation about how does the sensory experience of food impact these people?
Yeah, everyone eats, and everything consumes food or nutrients in some way or another, right? Mm-hmm. What kind of turns that question, about food into, I think, a sensory history question is, how is the experience of eating, or how is food used in the past to kind of structure society, right? Food and class, and food and race, food and gender, right? These are there's all sorts of entanglements with that. When it comes to captivity, food is also about kind of continuing, exercising individual choice, right? Taste is having taste, right? Is exercising a choice with regards to food and drink, and in a place of captivity, and to be honest, in soldiering as well, or in a time of war, this is effective as well. But it's kind of reorienting, or preserving or adapting to these new circumstances, maintaining that choice that is involved in taste. Coffee is a good example of this to kind of make it more tangible. Confederate soldiers are not drinking a lot of coffee in the armies, unless it's captured, right? Unless it's coming from outside of the South. I think Joan Cashin, writes about how there's probably more substitutes for coffee than there is anything else in a consumable good in the South. Confederate soldiers are drinking coffee in northern prisons. Union soldiers are not, right? Union soldiers in the South are suddenly consuming, burnt cornmeal in water, because it has that taste of kind of like coffee. You kind of convince yourself, if you may never drink coffee again, that this is some really watered down decaf coffee. But that's a way of preserving taste, right? It's an adaptation to preserve kind of a choice that one has had taken away from them.
That sounds like instant coffee to me. I don't know if I would like that too much. One of the things that I touch upon, because I'm usually a First World War historian, that is all my side gig, basically. And we often talk about cooties, and which of course is lice. And we see this come up over and over again, whether it's in your book with the sensory history, or talking about Cy Clegg like we did last week, or we talk about hardtack and coffee, or whomever it may be. How did fighting these kinds of things impact these men who are held in captivity, who literally can't escape these things?
Yeah, the lice in a way are in some ways kind of part of that carceral landscape. And I know that the metaphor exists outside of prisons as well, but Union soldiers calling lice graybacks, right? Miniaturizing Confederate soldiers, and also kind of calling the guards lice, is a way of kind of turning something that is dehumanizing and disgusting into something that is, an inside joke, right? It becomes funny And so part of, and I'll show you a document on this
Sure.
that is the front side of that, because prisoners don't and soldiers don't immediately get the joke, right? They don't immediately get that lice are not some, horrible plague that has been brought up upon them. So let's take a look at this.
Sure. He has the added bonus of having 2 monitors, everybody. So that's going to, that helps us a lot along the way. We're probably experiencing some storms in Pete's neck of the woods. That may be why we are having some problems with Pete. But go ahead, Evan, please.
All right. So this is coming. This is it's both a letter and a diary. Okay. It's a letter from William Hague to his wife. William Hague was captured in North Carolina in 1865. He's one of the kind of the last waves of Confederate prisoners who are being taken to northern prisons. Prisoners are restricted to writing on one side of one page. So this is not a literal letter that he's sending out. He's keeping a diary that he's writing in the narrative form of a letter to his wife, and he's writing it retrospectively. He's writing in June 1865 about his experiences being captured, going into prison, and the very first night of captivity. One thing I found is that prisoners were sometimes they're most kind of florid in their descriptions, most descriptive very early on, and this slowly went away. There's a desensitization, it appears. But this is what he says: the night passed off only to make the spectacle of horror around me more apparent. My tent mates were of the unwashed underclass, a feeling of something that I never felt before. So I wrote this down. But having a hard time reading it on the screen. Startled me, something creeping and crawling next to my skin. And then, for the first time in my experience, I found that I was lousy. Oh, horror of horrors, and no change of garments. I don't believe that I ever premeditated suicide before. But if such a thought was ever pardonable, it would be under such circumstances as I then found myself. Wow. There's a lot going on in there, right? He's describing the people he's found himself surrounded by, right? You mentioned cooties, right? Well, the discourse on cooties is that they have to come from somewhere, right? And they always come from somebody else, right? Where he has fallen in with the people who have the cooties. Here it's this unwashed underclass. So there's a clear tone that he is above this. He would not, under normal circumstances, even under soldiering circumstances, have expected to find himself covered in lice. Right. Wow. And the reaction, is not kind of the hardtack and coffee. Well, let's get out a tin plate and put a fire under it and watch these lice dance. He actually is. It's unclear if how serious he is. He's talking about suicide. Mm-hmm. He's saying, "I'm ruined." Right. My honor is at stake over this, right? Is implied. And that's the first experience, right? Lice become funny, but they become funny only after, it's described as, they're inescapable, right? The lice have a power that is, as important as the guards, right? Or as the weather, as the environment. And so it's the jokes that are made about lice, calling them graybacks. These are all adaptations that come after, I think, these very stark adjustments to captivity. Mm-hmm. And I want to welcome Pete finally. I know we've had some storms going through and internet issues going through the area. So Pete, thank you for getting through all that to be here.
Could you guys give me a quick summary so I could get up to speed here?
Yeah, we'll replay. We'll start from the top.
Do-over.
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't, because of course I'm somewhat anxious that I will be asking a question that's already been asked. But I could you, and maybe you've already done this about life, and why did a man feel unmade by life? I don't quite get that, and I think that speaks to a larger theme in your book. I believe that John has one, just in case. It speaks to a larger theme about how masculinity is challenged within the prisons. So, and again, maybe you've already addressed that. I'm sorry if you have.
No, that's a good clarifying question. It's part of the transformation of expectations of cleanliness that has taken a century to come about. You have ministers in the 18th century saying clean yourself of lice, right? Cleanliness is next to godliness. One of the things the next lines is clean yourself of lice. By the 19th century, there is the expectation that if you are if you are civilized, you don't have lice. Now there's some lies in that, I'm sure, right? That lice have been part of have been part of humanity since since agriculture. So it's not just relegated to certain parts of humanity, but it's explained in the antebellum period as William Gilmore Simms, in his not William Gilmore Simms, Simms the so-called gynecologist, talks about in his upbringing, learning that lice come from enslaved people, right? And so it is an affront to someone like Simms to have lice, in part because it's associated with blackness, right? It's associated with being enslaved. Urban reformers, right, are going to see lice as being something that has connotations of laziness, right? Not just poverty, not something that's done to someone, but as kind of a moral failing. And so these are the and that's all wrapped up in masculinity, like this distinction that he makes between the washed class and the unwashed class. He's seeing himself suddenly, he's thrust into the unwashed class, and then he's being kind of dragged down into the unwashed class as well. At least for how I'm reading the way that he's narrating this experience to his wife.
Absolutely. And I think that there's countless other examples that you have found, not just of POWs, but of men who are still in the field, of really of almost all social backgrounds, and that sense of losing themselves as civilized men, as Christian men. You see that time and time again. I'm reminded of a Georgia soldier who was semi-literate, maybe illiterate, and in a letter that he spoke to his wife, he described himself as being black as a sow, and that he didn't have enough money to buy soap to get clean, and that, of course, that he was lousy, that he had lice. And then at the very end of the letter, he wrote that be sure to tell their son, that he had a father, but that his father was a sorry one, right? And a great Southern line, right? To be sorry, that's very country, right? And that's a man of a lower class, a man again who is probably illiterate, but that's also a man who, in imagining that soldiering as an experience would be something that would be uplifting, that would strengthen morals, that would strengthen character, could never have imagined that there would be these kinds of physical tests, and how soldiers responded to it in a wide variety of ways as they did POWs. And like you said, life is with us. Kindergarten classes across the globe are dealing with it right as we speak. So, and then maybe you've already talked about this, and I was so eager to hear your thoughts about what is sensory history. Have you already talked about that?
We did, yeah.
We did, yeah. Sorry, Pete.
So after the camera,
I took the easy question, and I'm like, "What's sensory history?" And this is like started us off, but yes, we went over that. We talked a little bit about the public historian and the academic, and how we're starting to see a blend, and we're working together more because, as Evan pointed out, maybe there wasn't even a divide there. It was just self-made or self-imposed by some of us too,
Yeah, absolutely. Evan, I don't know what did you talk about? What are some of the challenges in talking and writing for a public? Because many things about this book, look, this is a beautifully written book. Evan, you write extraordinarily well, and the prose is so graceful, and I think it's really accessible. But what you do is you challenge the reader with this concept of sensory history. And so I'm trying to get a handle here. How can it make your writing more accessible, more engaging? And how does it also inform you being an interpreter and a teacher? To me, it seems like you're onto something here, and you probably guys didn't get a chance because we got to pay homage to your mentor, Mark Smith, who has done a number of books on sensory history, mostly focused on Southern history. But this book, The Smell of Battle and the Taste of Siege, is truly outstanding. Methodologically, it gives us a framework from which we can use sensory history. It shows us the possibilities and does it all, just like a student, in a very accessible prose, a beautiful prose, but a prose still with ideas. So I've talked here to give you some time to think. How does sensory history tell us, man? How does this make history of prisons as well as public history? How does it make it more accessible?
So, and one of the things that I said earlier was that I don't think it's that you say today we're going to have a sensory history tour, right? That's I've tried that, and it maybe it's just me, but it didn't work as well as I thought it would. Sometimes it's subtle, right? I'll give you an example of how it accidentally really made an important connection, I think, on a school tour I was giving at Andersonville. It was pouring down rain, and so we couldn't go outside. So I step on a bus and I go around the little loop. And we got to the place where there's at Andersonville where there's the recreation of these shelters, and I was explaining, this is why the landscape is deceiving, right? You see all this green, right? It actually would have been red, right? It's this and kind of the sandy soil that you see all over this part of Georgia, and we haven't touched we've just built above the ground, but prisoners, who are sick are going to be extra sensitive to changes in temperature. So when the temperature drops, it may be 95 degrees in the day, but if it drops down to 70, prisoners are going to be feeling like they're freezing. And that's one of the things they're digging into the ground to take advantage of thermal heating and thermal cooling. And I'll never forget this. There was a student who was sitting in the bus, and he was the sort of student who didn't see, he was kind of staring, right? He was paying attention, but he didn't look like he was having any fun. Right? Didn't look like he enjoyed being there. And so I made it my goal is I want to get something. I want to get a reaction out of this student by the end of the tour. And he had been silent. He hadn't asked a question. Hadn't said anything. And when I said they're digging into the ground, he blurted out, "That's what animals do." And there was silence, right? The students, I'm sure, thought, he's getting in trouble. And I said, yes, exactly. Exactly. And that's what people were saying in prison, right? That's what, they may not say about themselves, right? They're, they toy with this idea that, these are a lot of animal metaphors, but but they're aware, that they're not living like they want to be living, right? Like so-called civilized men. And so that was a way in which, by detailed descriptions of the environments of, you can let the audience do the work of calling it sensory, of taking that next interpretive leap. Right? It would not have been a good tour if I said I'm gonna tell you about how dehumanized the prisoners became.
Right.
It's inverted.
Right. Let the evidence do all the showing, right? Instead of the telling. Let me again. I'm going to follow quick up. And hopefully, again, it hasn't been asked. And I'm not. I'm playing a little devil's advocate here. I mean, I can see that even people watching this show would be somewhat skeptical because, Evan, you've already just pointed it out. The word sensory history, as soon as that comes out of your mouth, people are like sort of like, okay, God, what is he talking about? This sounds like academic jargon to me. This is making something really out of what's just ordinary. And this is what academics do, right? They take the ordinary of the past that people come to accept, people come to deal with, people come to cope with, and they have to invent things out of it, right? To make themselves seem so smart. So with that, again, as a backdrop, I'll ask you, help us understand the sounds of a prison and help us understand why they're just not sounds, right? They're not just because sensory history digs deeper into the meaning and symbolism of those sounds. But I think for most of us, we're like, man, a sound is a sound. A cannon is a cannon. Musketry is musketry. What's the big deal?
Well, you hear a gunshot at a firing range. That's one sound, right? If you're lost in the woods and you hear a gunshot, that means something else, right? Or you hear a dog barking, it means one thing. If you're running, if you're jogging, that might mean something. So context matters with sound. I have another document that might shed some sound on this. Let's take a look at Robert Bingham, a diary entry from Johnson's Island.
Oh, I'm sorry. There you go.
Okay, can you see it?
Yep, looks good.
So he's been a prisoner for about 6 weeks. He was captured he's a Confederate prisoner, captured while Lee's army was in Pennsylvania. He was part of a railroad guard further south. He gets picked up, and this was something I found interesting about prisoners who were more attentive to the senses than others. If they were going to write about sound ever, they were probably more apt to write about it on Sunday than anything else. And I just kind of picked that up as of how do I process a lot of sources quickly if I only have, one day to be at, the Pennsylvania Historical Society. On this so Sunday, the 9th of August. And, the part that I think is significant is very short. He says, Sunday here does not differ from any other days. There is no quiet, no holy calm. The same card playing, the same novel reading, the same profanity goes on as other days. And that's something that he comes back to again and again and again in his writing, right? It's the sounds, the noise that helps to make the sense of timelessness more closer to him, right? He's expecting the sounds of bells, right? He's expecting a good sermon, right? He has a sermon, but it's not he doesn't like the sound of it. He doesn't like the preacher very much. So it's and again, you probably noticed that there's some class connotations in there, right? He's talking about the rabble, right? The people who are playing cards, who are swearing. And so, Bingham again, and like Haig, is using, in this case, sound to kind of situate himself in that moment, right?
I would even add to that, there's auditory exhaustion, right?
Sure.
Auditory, and again, if you want to try to understand the words that we would tend to apply, you want to talk about trauma, if you want to talk about PTSD, and again, I usually don't use those words in my writings, but I understand for some people in our audience, that's a helpful category of analysis to try to really understand how these men or what these men were subjected to, just those grinding sounds. I know there are three of us have read in other letters of men in the camp, those moments that they're able to find some quietude, right? A place in which they can be able to reflect, where they can connect with their spirituality. Getting the quiet is so important. And I think your mentor, Mark Smith, does a brilliant job with the importance of silence within slave communities, because what it reminded the slaveholder of is of their power and of their control. And yet that silence was also unnerving to them, because they ascribed to African Americans animalistic characteristics that made them cat-like, right? So it's quiet, all's calm, all's good. Oh, but wait a minute, just maybe there is an enslaved person sneaking around here that we aren't hearing. So I think those sounds are important. Okay, I'm going to catch up for lost time here, John. Now my next question. Here we go. I have my students read documents, and I always tell them there are certain things you would have seen, things you would have heard, things you would have smelled. We know that from our understanding, let's just say, of combat. But time and time again, you're reading letters and certain things are missing. So I'm asking you, what were the smells that POWs were reluctant to describe? And if you want to go beyond that, tell me what you thought that should be there. I know it happened to them, but they wouldn't include it.
Yeah. I mean, there's many different points at which these things can be written out or of the record, or not come into the record at all, right? They first have to be written down, right? They then have to be preserved, and there's a culling process in the creation of the archive. So there's lots of different places for there to be censorship of these, again, to kind of use a more modern term, of these daily experiences. The prisoners write about just about everything, and soldiers do too. Certainly, it's not going to be every soldier, but prisoners write about bodily excrement. The sinks of Andersonville. They're pretty explicit about that. If anything, I will say that those sorts of smells, you would expect that to be constant, right? You would expect smell should be the easiest sense to write about for a Civil War prison, or for a hospital for that matter, right? But you do have to find the right kind of narrator, the historical narrator, to kind of take you to that place, and part of that might be I tend to lean on kind of culture rather than kind of biology to help kind of texture the senses, right? So and I don't want to necessarily rely on science to try to help explain the senses in 19th century America, but there's this thing, Febreze calls it nose blindness, right? Or anosmia is another term for it. Prisoners called it becoming deodored, right? Losing the sense, losing the ability to smell because things were too pervasive. Right. So there's actually a kind of a good reason why someone coming in to a prison might write about the sense of smell getting off the train, but might not be writing about it very much longer. Right? And this happens pretty fast. I mean, walk into a kitchen that is where that's active, right? You immediately kind of burst by the smell of something cooking, and that goes away pretty fast. So something horrible, on the flip side, that goes away as well. But therein lies one of the dangers to a 19th century smeller, is that if your nose, the nose is a bodyguard. You have people calling themselves sanitarians long before there is sanitizer, right? Long before there's actually something that's going to kill germs, before there's the idea that there are these microbiological things that are causing disease. Right? It's the idea that we can smell the things, the atmospheres, the airs, the regions that are going to make us sick. So there's good reason to be afraid if suddenly that beacon, that smoke detector, that carbon monoxide detector, that smell detector is suddenly not working like it used to. And not every prisoner, not every soldier writes about this, of course, but there are enough to kind of just to create that interpretation.
Right. Sorry, so that's why I'm going to keep with the smells here. I'm a guy who loves cologne, by the way. I take my daughters to the mall and we spray up, and my wife is appalled for a number of good reasons, especially at her husband, who has this. I love cologne. I'm sorry, I can't help myself. Leads to this. I know there's a company in England, I don't know the name of it, but they bottle up various smells. And I know Stratford Hall in Virginia, they purchased some of the smells so they recreate the odor of, I believe it was a stall or maybe a kitchen. So now Evan, as your interpreter, you're at Andersonville, you're chief of interpretation. This company comes to you and says, we got a smell of diarrhea for you. And I'm going to ask the other question for John. John, you're going to give a tour at Gettysburg. We've got the smell of blood. Your visitors can smell it. Your visitors can smell diarrhea. What do?
Pass.
You pass. You pass. Why would you pass?
Because the smell has been divorced from the historical context, right? You can recreate the physical smell, right, with the right chemicals, or you find the real stuff, right? But you can't recreate the 19th century nose, right? That associates much more strongly than we do today. And I'm not saying we don't do it at all, but we do associate smell with disease, or foul odors with disease. But that literal connection is not there. So even if we are smelling, it's a voyeuristic smell, right? It's not it has lost the power that it's had in the 19th century.
Okay. I'll give you a pushback here in just a little bit. John, what are you going to do? You have the opportunity to have your visitors smell blood on the battlefield.
I was also going to say pass, actually. We're not biting on this one, I guess, Pete. I was going to say pass because it was like when I used to do burial detail, there were certain things that I wanted to describe, but you not see or experience in that way. It was just something that I wanted to leave to the imagination. And when I read certain accounts where they say they could taste the blood in the air and it tasted like what we call like copper pennies or something, I would rather talk about something like that than to actually have it out there, because it allows people to have their own kind of safeguard against something they don't want to be triggered by as well. So I was going to say pass on that. But
yeah, I probably would as well. I mean, I think Evan, we part ways just a little bit. I think one could provide context, but even the most skilled interpreter would, I think, wrestle with audiences who would be oohing and not really, as you both have said, thinking about it in terms of how those smells, how it resonated with them as historical actors at that particular moment. I think that would be very difficult. Now, again, I'm quite certain that there is probably interpreters out there who've maybe not done it on a battlefield, but they have used these smells in ways that maybe have, added important layers to their interpretations. So, yeah, I share your reservations as well.
But getting back to your comment about cologne there, I mean, you could talk about, how do you make a cologne? What is a cologne in captivity, right? It might be smoking tobacco.
Yes.
Right. Covering up one smell with another. That's a common strategy. It's one of the reasons. I mean, it's also addictive, but it's one of the reasons why it's something that's sought after in captivity, because it helps to fight smell with smell.
Yeah, that's why I use cologne.
We smell with smell.
I remember an English professor. I came into his office, and there, of course, like most college offices in a history department, it was just a little cracker box. And I sat down. It was like 9 o'clock in the morning. That's when I loved polo. And he turned to me and he said, "It's a bit early, don't you think, to be wearing that much cologne?" So, do you have some other questions, or do we have any of our viewers who might have some questions?
Well, our good friend Jim Broomall says that Ben Lomond uses these features for the smell of gangrene, which I did not know. I don't know. I'd be kind of hesitant to want to smell that, but again, And also another viewer, Tyler Tierney, says the Imperial War Museum had smells in the trench recreation.
Yeah. Okay. There we go.
Which kind of leads me to this question, Evan, about do some historians use sensory history and not realize they're using it? They're describing something and they don't realize they're using what we call sensory history.
Sure. I think, again, sensory history is a tool, and it's not necessarily a new tool, right? Anyone who is doing a deep context about an experience is doing sensory history in a way. And I think, there's a lot of, Jim Broomall, since he, brought in a comment, right? I think, historians who are doing the history of emotions, right, are often also doing something very closely related to sensory history. Sensory history and emotions history really should be kind of firmly overlapped. They aren't always, but they probably should be. But there's, part of it, sensory history is, the kind of questions you might ask, right? You have like the Christian McWhorter, style, like let's talk about the sounds,
right.
How the war is fought over music, right. Or Jonathan White, right? And what happens when the lights go off, right? Let's talk about dreams. Let's talk about darkness. Let's talk about sleep. You had Megan Kate Nelson on last week, or earlier this week, maybe it was. And the idea of destruction as having kind of the aesthetic, the sublime, the beautiful ruins, right? That I think is a sensory approach, in part because it's trying to deeply contextualize something about the past, using all the tools that are available. And when you start doing that, you inevitably, if you're careful, will be invoking the historical senses.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said. Can I get another? Does someone have a question? Because I got one more.
Yeah.
So, the historiography on Civil War prisons, and the life of the prisoner is extraordinarily robust. Lots of exciting things. We had Angie Zombek. Was she our first guest or our second guest, I believe? No, John. It's
a while back, yeah.
But I'd like for you to just tell us, where are we in terms of, do we need, I don't know, a study of Camp Johnson? Is that where we are? We need individual camp studies, or do we need to do something more comparative? Do we need to go? Everyone's going global. Why not do it with Civil War prisons? Where do you think the scholarship needs to head?
Oh, that's a dangerous question for me. I don't know. I think that's up to the next, that's up to the generation of graduate students to figure out.
You are still wet behind the years. You are a young historian. I'm not going to let you get by with that. Come on, where would you?
So I would like to see. I'd like to see fewer policy studies, right? And I think we're moving in that direction, right? I'm tired of case studies of prisons that focus more on the what's going on in the officers' quarters and just whether or not the prisoners are getting enough food or not, right? You have to. We have all these sources that are available to us. We have all these voices. We are missing a huge opportunity if we're not trying to learn from them. I think there's a huge opportunity to take a more clearly cut environmental approach. Right? These are contained environments. These are petri dishes. So there's a lot of interesting things. I try to get at some of that with the lice, but I'm not a trained environmental historian. I'm kind of an omnivore of Civil War history. I try to bring in lots of different things. So there's totally room for for an environmental historian to do more on Civil War prisons. Material culture is Joan Cashin is doing all this, and Jim Broomall and others are doing all this great work on material culture. And I think that's I always worry that the prisons can get left out, right? The Cambridge history of the American Civil War, right? One chapter on Civil War prisons, and it's about policy, right? So I think that's a missed opportunity. So But so when we do the material culture, if there's a material turn, and that may actually be a kind of reversion to material history, because it's always been there, just like the senses have always been there. We need to think about how are prisoners using their hands in captivity? What are they? They're making things. They're making jewelry, right? They're using this to help them survive. Leah Lane Oxford wrote a master's thesis about carved pipes in the American Civil War, and there's a lot of those that have to do with prisons. So what are the creative products that are coming out of the trauma of the American Civil War? The high art, we've talked about. We could talk about it more. But what about kind of the folk art that's also coming out of this? The carved bullets, the fishing sinkers made out of bullets. The graffiti. That's every southern town seems to have. I was in the Masonic Hall in Franklin, Tennessee last fall, and they're doing this great work of taking off the layers of paint and preserving all the graffiti that was left on the walls. Like that is really that's really important, or it could be, right? It could be the base for some really interesting, nuanced studies of this era. So is that more of a response?
I'm glad you didn't punt on that question. That was fantastic. I think the material culture angle, it gets sort of lost, and really, I think is kind of the first shot fired in the field regarding Civil War historians is Michael DeGrecchio's piece, who wrote a piece in Weirding the War. And of course, I probably usually have these books close at hand. I'll show our viewers next week. Steve Berry edited the piece, Weirding the War. Michael DeGrecchio does a fantastic, really sort of a big picture take on material culture and a call for historians to start to integrate it into their work, and which they have done, I think. But there, of course, as you point out, there's a lot more to do. All right, John, do we have anything else from our viewers?
We have a lot of great comments as usual, and I do want to say that Cameron Sowers, one of your students, has been filling the feed up with some great comments. So that's all a testament to you and the CWI for grooming Cameron into such a good historian. So he also sharing. So.
He and the other students, Fredericksburg and Andersonville.
Yeah.
Evan, you'll be pleased to know that our two Gettysburg students are headed down to Andersonville this summer. So Andersonville did not cancel their seasonal program. Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania did not, and Vicksburg. Now, maybe there are other parks that I'm unaware of, but we have all those students who are headed down there. And so, yeah, they've always really enjoyed their time down in Andersonville as well. Evan, really quickly, what are you working on next? What's your next book?
I don't have a next book per se.
Yeah.
I'm a public historian, so I wrote a book on the American Civil War and on the prisons. I don't know that my next one, when there's a next one, I don't know what that will be. I don't know if it will be in that century.
Right.
I'm on this local history kick, or because local history is sometimes a four-letter word, a public history of nearby places. But I've been writing for the newspaper for the last year. Every month I come out with a 1,500-word essay on something in the area that connects to a broader theme in U.S. history. And so for June, because of the moment we're in, with the murder in Minneapolis, right, with the protests, with the Black Lives Matter protests. I'm working on a 4-part series that's for the local paper that will publicly talk about, for not the first time, but for maybe the most sustained time, a lynching that took place in downtown Americus. In full view of 400 people, and ultimately, what is the responsibility of people in the 20th century to do today to commemorate that? Right, we're working with the Equal Justice Initiative, working with the National Museum for Justice and Peace, So, I'm working on a lot of little projects right now.
I'll just say that's no little project, and it reminds me of the conversation we had Monday with Megan Kate Nelson, in which we spoke about the various ways in which historians can engage our public's, ways that we can help them give long historical context to contemporary issues today. So it's exciting to see a scholar of your abilities who can write again. It's about prisons, and I say, God, this is a beautifully written book, and it really is. I hope at some point you'll come back to the Civil War and write another book.
I'm going to leave the Civil War, but I will do some other things too.
It's because it's a mighty fine book, and I also like the fact that you are finding ways to engage local communities, because that is so important. And I will end with this because I thought, well, maybe we should talk a little bit about the R.E. Lee Monument in Richmond. It appears that it's going to be removed, and I didn't want to get bogged down as to whether we should remove monuments or let them stay. I think that we should, though, remind ourselves at this moment that can be very much of a distraction from these protests that are going on and what is animating those protests. And there's a range of reasons, and we know that, of course, what initiated was the murder in Minneapolis. And so doing what you're doing, Evan, I think it's so vital. And I hope that historians and people who are interested in the Civil War, I know they feel very passionately about the issue of Confederate monuments, but I really do hope that it won't be a distraction from us really sort of focusing on the essence of these protests. And I just want to end with a quote, Evan, that I found on your webpage. And it's a beautiful quote. It's a quote that I think I agree with all my heart, and seeing it being lived out as we speak is one that gives me great hope and faith for the future. And here's it. I love America more than any other country in this world. And exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually.
James Baldwin.
It's just beautiful, is it not?
Yeah.
Beautifully written, the content, its essence, its spirit. Man, it's just gets a hold of you. So, and doing my background check on you, I was able to come across that. Evan, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much again. And again, this book, Living by Inches, go to the UNC page. You'll get 40% off, 40% off. 40% off. You can't get that on Amazon. They won't do it. They won't do it for my book, but UNC will. And like I said, it is a really engaging, thoughtful book. And again, Evan, such a pleasure. You again, and we should also add, John, hey, congratulations on the house. Congratulations on being a father in a few months.
Yeah.
Weeks.
No.
Maybe days.
Go buy the book. He's gonna be a father.
Yeah, that's right. And you need to get home. You need to get home to your wife.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks again. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's good.
Hey, thank you, Evan, and thank you, Pete. As always, I'm glad you got to join us. I'm sorry about the weather outside; it's causing all kinds of problems with you and with the internet. And hopefully, it came through well for everyone. It didn't freeze up or anything. Yeah. But thank you again, Evan, for joining us. I put the book link in the description. I also put the code in the description as well, just in case you guys didn't get a chance to see it flash across the screen. Thank you for all your questions and comments on YouTube and on Facebook. We will see you on Monday evening.
Kevin Levin. That's what we should.
Kevin Levin, Monday evening, yes.
On Black Confederates.
Yes.
Not so controversial at all.
No, not too controversial at all. Yeah, that's great.
Should be an easy conversation, I think.
It's going to be a good conversation, a lively one, and we're really looking forward to that. So thank you again, Evan. Thank you, Pete. Have a wonderful evening. Take care, everybody.